Yeah, so today's talk is not a brain injury talk, but I think it has drastic implications towards brain injury, and that's, the perspective that I'm coming at this with. I had a subdural hematoma. I didn't quite hit the midline, but very close, mainly right parietal, extending, pretty far back. But I had a very specific feeling after my brain injury that other people use the words stranger to yourself. My mind was not my mind. My inner me was not me. It took me a while to figure that out, but it was a very clear feeling. I just couldn't make sense of it. And your research and the Parvizi Lab's research is, I think, very fascinating, very cutting edge. And it is, I don't know what you would call it, basic neuroscience or fundamentals of what
Yeah,
the
I
brain is
think,
creating.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I
Um,
would characterize it into fundamental neuroscience. Actually, I did my PhD in clinical neurosciences in the
okay.
UK,
Okay.
also collaborating with the hospital, and we were based at the Department of Anesthesia. So the patient group we have happened to be the traumatic brain injury patients,
Right.
but most of them, like I'm not a medical doctor, so I don't have like direct interaction with them, but I have had a lot of access to their brain data,
Right.
neuroimaging data. So most of them are severe TBI, with reduced states of consciousness, even vegetative states. So my
Mhm.
previous talk was about brain networks and their implications to consciousness. And we know self is at the core of human-like consciousness. This is what I'm specializing. I wouldn't say specializing because nobody does. So I'm interested in studying self in my present project, and that's the paper you read about.
Great.
Um, so now I'm a third-year postdoc researcher from the Department of Neurology and Neurological Sciences in Stanford. So I'm the neurological sciences part. So I'm not a medical doctor, but I mean, I think the main goal for our scientific research ultimately is really trying to increase the well-being of human lives. So there's nothing that can make me happier to hear that my research turned out to be very appealing to people and can maybe help them to understand themselves. This is really, I feel really honored to be invited to give the talk. And I have to thank you, David, for inviting me to share my research with all of you. And and I know that that is very tough to deal with the conditions that is not addressed enough by modern medicine, because we are in the modern medicine, they deal with the severe symptoms, right? But the minor ones are kind of left behind. But I think with the modern technology and more advances in the scanning and also the more personalized clinical assessment, these things will be addressed in the future. And at least that's what I hope.
Thank you
But,
for saying that. And your choice of words, the severity versus minorness, I think that the loss of self, the nature of it, it doesn't even make sense unless you've had it. It doesn't exist without, it's just so strange, but it's a drastic change and it's like not on the radar with what your data is showing and hopefully future directions because research moves slowly and changing people's perspective moves slowly, but I think it's a major problem and it needs a just beginning to recognize it for people to be curious, for people to believe that it's a very specific feeling. I think that helps, a lot.
yeah.
So let's get started, or please, however you want to begin.
Okay. So hello everyone. I just did my introduction, and just to re-emphasize that I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. I'm more of a researcher than a medical doctor. And my research was more on the fundamental neuroscience about how different brain parts to organize information and make sense of what we perceive, both the outside world and ourselves. Um, so the contents of my talk will be divided into 3 parts, and later on we'll have discussion and speculation on what we have been through. The first part is about dissociation, dissociative states, including depersonalization and derealization, and how they are related to mild traumatic brain injury. And the second part is trying to dig into the brain mechanism behind this. What are the brain networks for processing the information about an I and a me? In fact, what is the difference between them? And the third part, I'm going to talk about my own research about self-dissociation. So here I'm showing you a review paper 2 decades ago. In this review paper, they reported results of 70 patients who underwent their or mild TBI, who underwent neuropsychological assessment on average 22 months following a head injury. Half of them reported the feeling of unreality immediately following the head injury. And patients, mostly with mild head injuries, are more likely to develop the so-called dissociation, including depersonalization and derealization. And only 20% of them continuing to have this problem 6 weeks after an injury. So the authors estimate that about 13% of the patients may develop chronic depersonalization following a head injury. So that's about 1 in 5 people who may have concussion who can develop this dissociation. This is quite prevalent. I cannot move on. Okay. This is quite prevalent, 1 in 5 people. But in the literature, now we are looking at the literature review paper did last year. So that's a recent comment made by Simon, this researcher, saying that we are still lacking a lot of data on traumatic injury that is associated with psychogenetic derealization, and some of them comorbid with post-traumatic PTSD. So what are we talking about? Dissociation is a combination of depersonalization and derealization. They are very similar and they always group together. So the first one, depersonalization, is more focused on the detachment of someone themselves, as if one is an outside observer while watching over his own body or their own body. And the latter one, derealization, is a sensation that the external world is strange. So that's focused more on the environment, but they always combined with each other. So in the later of the presentation, I mainly will call dissociation, because there's not a very clear differences between depersonalization and derealization. And here it's a case report many years ago, just to give people who don't know this condition very well a sense of what dissociation may feel like in a real case. So this patient, AO, is a car accident victim. His CT scan, EEG, and SPECT, both during the acute phase and 9 months after the injury, showed no abnormality. And his cognitive assessments are very normal, actually above average. He doesn't show any deficit of all of the cognitive things like visual perception or memory, things like that. And he doesn't have psychiatric history. He has a very nice childhood. Everyone thinks he's a nice person. But after the traumatic brain injury, he reported as himself split it into 2 parts, as if like 2 loudspeakers of a stereo system, which are disconnected and speak with different voices. So this can be very disturbing to someone's day-to-day life, but it's very also very disappointing that we seem not to be able to find a physical breakdown of the hardware. But I have to emphasize that our technology right now, like usually the normal screening in hospital, like CT scans, are not really designed to look at the abnormality in the white matter. And sometimes with mild TBI, the injury on the white matter is so little because the neuron, the axons, is thinner than a strand of hair. And our resolution, the best machine we have for now, at most have only 1 millimeter, 1 millimeter cubic resolution. So it's really, really hard to actually see what the hardware, how the hardware breaks down. Sometimes just the subjective report, the psychiatric assessment can tell us more than those brain scans. So now we are going to talk about the brain. Why this splitting self could happen in us. It sounds like something additive to our brain. Sounds like one self split into two. But I have to emphasize that to me, it's not additive. It's actually a deficit of information integration. Because how can a brain actually process information to understand what's going on in the real world and ourselves? Imagine you are the brain sitting in this dark, airtight skull. How can you make sense of the real world? The best you can do is to rely on the sensory organs who can translate the physical particles into the language that your brain or nervous system can understand. In this example I'm showing you is a cartoon. I'm trying to make a point that the outside physical world is very noisy. By noisy, I mean not all of the physical phenomenon are really irrelevant to us. And we have to filter out the information and to make use of them. But how do we know what do we see? We can only rely on what our sensory organs tell us. So without giving any background knowledge, when you look at this image, you could either interpret as a girl holding a mirror or a gypsy man. So that's our daily task the brain has to deal with. But to resolve this conundrum, nature has evolved us to make us able to store memory, to store accumulating evidence in our memory system. We also evolved to have a language system which we can use to communicate with others to double check our information. And these two systems seem to be what humans generally better than the animals. So similarly to how we interpret the external world, we also have to constantly interpret the signals from ourselves. In this situation, for example, I'm setting up a scene where a person going into an office, and from his first perspective, he sees the table, the desk, and also where his feet lands. Also, he can double check with his interoceptive senses about where his body parts, like his arms is, and where using his tactile information to match up this information from all around to make sense of where he is located. So you could imagine that the brain is a very intricate cooperative system with many parts working at the same time. Everything has to be working in perfect synchrony. If there is something lagging, something missing, those could be messed up by some wrecked white matter. Then if things are slightly in sync, then misinterpretation could occur. That may underlie what people sometimes, the dissociation that some people may perceive in some situations. Now I'm going to be more specific about what we are talking about. So this is a general model this is the same as what we just talked about. So every sensory modules, like motor, olfaction, auditory, coming in to to your body, to your brain, to the very integrated system is a system, and to build up this model about self. And with this model of the self, you present the information in a coherent way to sketch some figures that you think yourself, who yourself is. So by drawing up like this process, we could kind of think that the system, like your body, including your brain, all of the central and peripheral system coming up as something, as a unity. This is the I system, because it's constantly making up the story about who you are by utilizing all of the physical information you gather from both your body and the physical stimuli. And there is a me part, which is the story you're making about yourself. So that's the image you picture in your mind, and that is the me part. So the I part is mostly a working part, and probably largely subconscious, because that's like it's constantly doing something in order to make a picture of yourself. And the me part is the conscious representation of who you are. This is not just a theoretical dissociation of the I and the me, but also they are actually governed by different brain territories. So our brain is not uniformly like structured. It has many different parts, and most of the parts are really like functionally specialized. But with the functional specialized part, some of them work more closely to each other than others. And those regions working more closely with each other, we call it a network, because they have a rather homogeneous functional specialization, even though each part is probably doing its own thing. But they are friends. You could kind of think of it this way. So let's start with the easier part, which is the me. The me part is easier to study because it's a conscious representation about yourself. Because it's conscious, it can be conveyed, so it can be assessed. So by assessing it, we could design a computerized task, like showing people their image of themselves. And then by contrast, we could show image of someone look like themselves but not quite. And then we look into the brain activation when people seeing themselves and seeing another image which is not self. And we look into the brain activation pattern that differs in these two conditions. Not just, yes.
Can I ask a question about that consciousness versus not necessarily conscious distinction? Just to get it straight, so the me is a conscious running inner narrative, and then the I, can it can go in and out of consciousness, or it's like normally subconscious, or how would you distinguish it?
So it's a very tough question. I think I part can be both conscious and unconscious, because the reason I think it's unconscious is because it is constantly running in the background, and you don't really usually perceive that yourself is doing that. So it's like sitting in the core of consciousness. It's the system that gives rise to consciousness, almost like that.
You think of it as okay, interesting. Um, and then the other thing I just wanted to say is the network centric stuff that you're talking about. That's pretty consistent with a lot of what the neuroscience is showing nowadays. I just wanted to point that out because I think it's important to it's like the nature of how the brain is working, and we're only kind of discovering that now.
Exactly.
I just want to add
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. In neuroscience, we have this long tradition of localizationism. by which I mean we used to think that different cognitive function is situating at different parts of the brain. So every region is very specifically working on some part of your cognition. Like there's a language part, there's a motor part, this is a visual part, seeing part, hearing part. But only in just like 2 decades ago, we discovered that this is not the case. Even though regions tend to specialize on some functional modules, they always work together. Because think about it, it never happened in your real life that you hear something without stimulating some of the image in your mind. So everything is really connected together, and you cannot watch an image without thinking of anything else. You could think, oh, this image look nice, or this image look familiar or not. So everything is really working together. And here we are talking about this scale. It's not one region, but like the system level of the brain. So now we are talking about me network. This is a narrative self network because really just by how we define it in doing the task, where we ask the person to think about themselves or ask them to remember what has happened in their lives. And then we discover that this network is very hot or very activated when you are doing this activity. It's you could call it episodic memory. You could call it autobiographical memory network. Even the language network is very closely related to these regions. They are not exactly quite like it's the same, but they overlap a lot. So now we are talking about a more complicated network, and just as what I said before, it's very tricky to say whether this network is conscious or not, because it is like, I would say it's what the working of this gives rise to consciousness, because it's about making sense of self and the environment. It is like a prerequisite of any conscious experience. And to be able to do that, we could think of something more similar. It's not yet forming a uniform self, but just about multisensory bodily processing. So as I said before, that when you enter into the room, there are so many different cues you can use to make sense of the scene. And interestingly enough, the auditory cues and visual cues, all these sensory cues in the real world are not randomly presented. They are actually forming certain probability pattern. So certain auditory and certain visual cues tend to bind more together than the rest. And our brain is really involved to capture that. So in this example, I will make it more concrete by introducing you to this experiment. In this experiment, the participant would wear a goggle with virtual reality. So within the goggle, what they see is a real image, a virtual image of themselves. That is because there is a camera shooting at themselves in the back, and they are seeing in front of themselves their back. And in the meantime, the experimenter very cleverly introduced another sensory information, which is the stick stroking at the back of the participant. So by doing so, in the visual environment, what the participant would see is that an image of themselves, which is their avatar, is being stroked. So it looks like another person who look a lot like themselves being stroked, but at the same time, they are stroked at their own back. So only by doing so for 10 minutes, the person would have a feeling that the avatar in the virtual reality is part of themselves, even though it is not, because it's a image, it's a virtual image. So this is the example of how brain make use of the tactile information and the visual information to build up something, some object that they call themselves. So in the interview after this experiment, the participant would be asked to rate how much they think the avatar they see from the virtual reality is part of themselves. And usually you get a robust effect. By doing so, I think I want to make a point that the multisensory bodily processing, by synchronizing, like feeling the different kind of sensory information in sync to give rise to a sense of unity, that's at the core of the bodily self network. And then we could see during this experiment, what regions activated are the same regions being activated by the multisensory bodily processing. So the two things are probably combined in the same system. So we need to have this multisensory bodily processing in order to build up a unified sense of self, and that is at the core of a bodily self network. So what I have told you just now, it's an introduction of what we already know in the previous literature. What is a bodily self network and what is a narrative self network? Now I'm going to talk a little bit about my own research. So I do intracranial EEG, which means that we have a very unique cohort of patients who have this refractory epilepsy that cannot be stopped by medicine anymore. So they go to the hospital to have their brain monitored in order to identify when and how the seizure spread out in the brain. That gives us a unique opportunity to observe how the signals are processing in weird situations. And before they do any surgery, we need to stimulate across each electrodes inside of their brain to make sure that we don't lesion any brain region that is important to some cognitive function like language or memory. We will avoid to do that. But in order to do that, we need to screen them and to make sure that those electrodes are in other areas. And in this process, we get a lot of byproduct, which is that we can get some interesting phenomena that we wouldn't have got from other patients. With neuroimaging, it's really indirect measure, but here we have like direct assessment of the neural activities. It's the direct ones, not based on the blood oxygenation level that neuroimaging rely on. So this is the background of our patient group, and in this cohort, the study started with a patient coming to us complaining that before his seizure, he always felt a sense of self-dissociation. And it turns out his seizure did not start from the temporal lobe, which is mostly where the seizures generated from. His seizure from this area, this red area that I marked here, is called anterior precuneus. It doesn't matter what they called. But what the important thing about it is that it situates in between the bodily self-network and narrative self-network that I just introduced. So this is a cartoon I drew based on how, like, the actual location in the brain. And anterior precuneus here, you could see it's like a sandwich being surrounded by these two networks. And by stimulating this area, let's just listen to what the person actually talk. This is the patient who came to us complaining a problem, and we stimulated this particular region in his brain, and here is his response. Actually, can you see my screen? There is an actual screen showing up.
I can see the screen that you're trying to click on.
Can you see this actual screen now?
Yeah.
So I wish the audio will work. If it doesn't, I'll just explain what he said.
Is there audio with it?
So there is actually audio, but can you hear it?
I can read it.
So I'll just read it. So the person said, the first thing I noticed was that it felt like the whole world of freedom I was talking to you about. So the three spatial dimension and X, Y, Z. He was using that example because he was an engineer. So basically, he's describing the spatial space with X, Y, Z axis. I could feel them move. They are kind of distorted. And he said, the emotion or feeling of where in this 3D space am I? And I went through the feeling of the process very slowly of refiguring out that. And it was like listening to another conversation in my brain. And he said, I really enjoyed it. It was kind of like the experiencing going to the, sorry. So he was mumbling. I'm just going to describe it like a computer because it's the best way I know how to describe it. And the analogy is that imagine there are these two ICs speaking with each other, and these two computers, they speak with each other. But there is one data buff. I also don't know what it is. What it does is that there is this one information highway. I want to speak with this computer X, Y, Z. Now A and B are speaking, but they can only speak among its information highway that the CPU is always able to listen to. So basically what he described is that there are two parts of himself speaking to each other, but he is actually left out of it. So he was saying, so I'm listening to A and B speak with each other, trying to figure out what the hell is going on. And as a result, I'm listening to this conversation. The CPU is trying to figure out, maybe I am the CPU, me. I don't know what that means necessarily. So I guess because the audio doesn't work, I think that's the gist of it. And later on, he described that he has to throw a blanket over himself to make sure that he is actually here. So this is not too different than what we saw from the previous case. By stimulating this area, I think we kind of make a very compelling case that we somehow distorted this person's representation of self. And we went on to look into the connectivity. By connectivity, I mean how information is transferred in the brain. So how do we do that? Because we have electrodes inserted in different areas of the brain. And we also have those electrodes in the key area where by stimulation, it can induce the self-dissociative states. So those hot electrodes are our seeds. We stimulate those areas and we listen from all other electrodes. And we could sometimes listen to, in some place, get information, get a signal by stimulating the seed area, sometimes not. So those regions that we can record something from by a stimulation are those the two regions would have a connectivity, because only by doing so we could listen to the seed areas talking. In this way, we map out how other areas connect with our seed regions. And we found that this seed area is not really connected with the narrative self, but with the bodily self. Nevertheless, this position is very, very close to the blue areas. These blue areas are the regions at the core of the narrative self, but stimulating them, you wouldn't get any self-dissociative response. And our hypothesis is that because this sausage place in the network, in the bodily self network, is constantly doing this information integration between your multisensory integration and also talking to the narrative self part to build up a coherent sense of self. So by stimulating this area, we kind of interrupt this process. Then the person feel like they dissociation between self and environment. That is our interpretation of this. And now we can relate a little bit back to our mild TBI case. Because in mild TBI, there could be a lot of white matter. White matter are the highways or the connectivity between regions that somehow is broken or myelinization is somehow reduced. There could cause a delay of information or even broken down of the information transmission. And that's basically doing the similar thing as what we're doing here with electrical stimulation. There's a misinformation going around, and then somehow the information is not in sync. So as a high level cognition, you might interpret things differently. That's how we think the things are. So
thank you. And yeah, it generates a lot of questions. And so I could say that the people in this audience are people who have, at least some of the people here and myself, the depersonalization, the derealization, and it's hard to explain. Like the example you gave, we have that trying to explain it, trying to give specific. The thing is, the experience is specific. The experience is not wishy-washy. It's just hard to put it into words. So it's like, in the beginning, you said you're not a clinician, you're a researcher, and then the clinicians talk to the researchers. I think that there's a missing discussion between the branger people and the researchers, because it's like, yeah, we're like that guy, but we didn't have the electrodes put in. I just know several people here, and I've had some interviews, but I have a lot of discussions with them about that kind of a feeling. I had very clear reality is not the same, and then very clear my inner me is not the same. Took a while to realize it. So anyway, yeah, I just want to say that the audience here is aware of this in a acute way.
So I wonder, like, can you give me more specific example? So sometimes dissociation can present in many different ways.
Yes.
The very, very severe case could be that you watch over yourself from outside. Very specifically, you know that you're outside and you're floating in some outer space, something like that. That's what I read from the literature. But I think by stimulation, this area, what we get is not that specific. Mostly they feel like their body is lifted up. That's the most consistent effect we get. So it's not as specific as some people report that they actually see themselves from another angle. I want to know, like, what exactly you feel like you actually see it, or you feel like you could have seen it.
Oh, okay. I can share with my experience, and I also want to say that I've spoken to people where they're like they describe it as their bodily self, their body of who they are, and their mind-body connection that got injured. I got my mind, my inner mind injured, and I always thought it was right parietal, internal speech, internal voice. But the reality thing that I had, so I didn't notice it in the hospital, and when I got home, immediately it was like, this is not the real world. This is like the real world. And the feeling that I would just say that everything was like what it is, but it's not real. It felt off, felt not the same. But that lasted until I remember like 17, 18 years after my brain injury when that feeling went away, because that hit me like, what just happened? Because it doesn't feel like that anymore. And there was two real stark experiences in my garden and in my house. And then I went on a trip to California where I'm from, and I'm walking around. I'm like, okay, now it feels like reality is back, and that freaked me out. So that very specific. And in the first 6, 8, I don't remember, 6 months or 8 months after my brain injury, did I recognize that the feeling that my inner mind was not my mind, I finally put a label on it. But I swear I had that feeling from the moment that I remember. And then that feeling subsided 5 or 6 years after my brain injury, but it was that one kind of broke my reality in the
Mm.
sense that I was like, that is not supposed to happen. What does that mean that that happened? It
Mm-hmm.
didn't happen every once in a while. It felt like all the time, like the inner me is not there anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
couldn't really
Mm-hmm.
explain it. Doctor, I remember trying to explain to the doctor and she didn't understand and I gave up because I
I
thought I was
see.
alone with it. But I know people here that have that similar
Yeah.
feeling in that sense.
Yeah, I'm so sorry that the doctor just denied your feeling.
I
And
think it's common with brain injury. It's a sad thing, yeah, but thanks. No.
but I think maybe
Very
they are very specific. Sorry.
Someone else want to say something?
Yeah.
Someone in the chat wrote that I have felt lifted up flying, then later I experienced speaking it as normal, and then
Oh, I
speaking.
was just saying very common. The doctors.
Oh. Um, I have to say that actually this depersonalization or dissociation is not really specific to mild TBI. It's very, very common in a series of many different kinds of neurological conditions. So as long, even in migraine, like as mild as migraine, sometimes they feel the derealization. So I also personally have experienced these dissociative states when I was younger. Like when I was very very stressed for my examinations, I had those episodes of me like just floating in the outer space. I don't know from where, but I see myself from outside of window, things like that. I also had those conditions in dreams. So I'm from a researcher. I think based on what I know about the brain, I feel like a lot of the feeling that you are not here or you are outside, it's really interpretation. It's not that the diseases causes something specific that make you feel exactly that, but because there is something, some information not really in place, not integrated in the right moment, or just some lag, some desyncing happening. With it can happen in many different mechanisms, but the common output is that because your brain trying to understand, make sense of the information it gets, and the information can get all the way to your sensory, very low level sensory organs, and your brain doesn't know how to deal with all this information. It's trying to make up a explanation to it, and it doesn't feel real to you because things are not in sync, and they should be in sync. If everything is in sync, then you feel like right here. But if it's not, then it's, you will come up with the conclusion that you are not here. That's my thinking.
So I think that that's interesting because you have certain experiences. Um, I will just say that I think with brain injury, there's it's almost like occlusion of symptoms in the sense that the other symptoms can seem like that, like other traumas can have a derealization. But I think a brain injury is unique and not yet covered because it's like you're just discovering this system in this brain region. But what happens when, along with the white matter input and output from there, that actual region has gotten crushed, has gone physically. They
Mm,
don't have the assays to study that. Like with memory, you can have memory problems, but your hippocampus and that circuitry is okay, but the other systems that feed into it don't work. So I think that the derealization, in my experience, was so weird and different from other things. And I've only found other brain injury people to talk about similar things with. So it's like I think it's a different version of that problem. And because it doesn't necessarily go away. There's a researcher at UCLA and he just moved to Japan and I don't have his name, so I'm forgetting it. Maybe I'll take that out of this talk, but he studies like subjective reality and he's discovered this circuit that kind of makes your subjective reality in a moment to moment basis. And I thought to myself, oh, I think I injured that. I think that got hurt and that would make more sense to me than um, like my wife has had fevers where she's hallucinating and outside of her
Mm-hmm.
body. But
Mm-hmm.
does that mean she
Mm-hmm.
injured the same part? I don't
No,
think
no.
so. Yeah,
I
so
think, yeah,
it's difficult in that sense because
yeah.
it's
Yeah, that's exactly my point. I think it's very diffusely represented in the brain, but I do agree that there are some brain regions more closely related to this representation of self than others.
Yeah.
But basically anywhere matters because the self is like kind of integrating all kinds of information you can possibly get to build up, like to make sense of what's going on right now. What is in me? Who am I? Where am I? So anywhere that is hurt, like your brain really trying to come up with a strategy how to cope with this, then this thing could happen. But maybe in some areas it's more closely to that function. If your injury happen to land there, then it will cause more severe symptoms than others. But it doesn't mean that when other people have this condition, it's necessarily hurting that circuits.
right. We're here because of brain injury. That's the thing that needs to be considered and isn't. Nick, did you have or it's sometimes dismissed. Nick, did
Yeah,
you
I
have
was
a?
just,
Yeah.
I've been taking notes and writing down different words. But I have a lot of uh empirical evidence that supports all these ideas that you've been talking about. And so thank you so much for doing this research. It's been great and presenting.
Thank you for your
Um,
feedback.
it helps me feel like when I'm listening to these voices I hear in my head, I'll often jump out and say, "Oh, you're schizo," the way the voices work. But the more I listen to them, the more it's like watching a movie and seeing footage from a movie pass through the feed. And like I'm learning through about alterity, what it means to be, it's a weird phenomenon. It's not
Mm-hmm.
how it was before the injury. Uh,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I got my sense of self. It was never as questioned as it is now.
Mm-hmm.
The injury to self nature with brain injury. I actually have three categorizations of it. If I could I'll spit it out. One is the loss of who we were, our abilities, our identity. The other is, if you injure memory regions, cognitive regions, other parts of your brain, you lose parts of what your self was, and those are really strange. And then I think if you injure these regions that you're presenting today, that's a whole nother layer. And I only know because I've experienced it. I can't imagine it. But I
Mm-hmm.
just was trying to make sense of it for a long time. And
Mm-hmm.
the interconnectivity of the brain makes it that much more complicated. Just to finish off what we were saying a moment ago.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
think you'd have to have a fMRI, somebody watching you while you're thinking these things for you to get some good science on it. And you're using the fMRI to record the brain.
Here we record the brain by intracranial EEG. So the sample rate, like the rate where you sample in a specific period amount of time is much higher than fMRI. In fMRI, you get one scan every 2 seconds. In EEG, you get 1,000 scans in a second. That's the difference we're talking about. And usually, when we talk about the most of the cognitive things, it's really, really fast paced.
Sure.
So here we do rely on fMRI to get a brain network in a large scope. But when we look into the specific function, how they are performed at a very transient, faster pace, we look into the IEEG. Just to clarify our methods.
Thank you for
And thank you for sharing your experience of watching your live episode like laying out in front of you. I had a similar experience by food poison. So I also had this distorted perception of that. I feel like I have endless copies of what's going on right now. So it's one copy, and when I think about this copy, another copy generated, and it's just adding up to each other. Everything is kind of lagged behind, and I lose the sense of time. Again, I was quite convinced that it was not real because
Yeah, you still have a sense of time, but it's like the time series can be lost. But the
yeah,
feeling of time
yeah,
duration is still there, being present.
right, right. But yeah, So but it felt like an eternity.
That's good. That's good that you've had these experiences because otherwise people won't listen. It's like you need to get some version, even if it's not brain injury, it's still like a reality change. And there's several people relating in the chat, and I'm not gonna try to read it because each one it's the wording and articulation is hard, but it's I'll save it in the chat. Do you think that the self can be exercised, like with brain injury, rebuilding, improvement, regaining? It's like a process of repetition, but oftentimes we're repeating the very minute things that only kind of the therapist know about. So, do you think that the loss of self stuff and maybe reality also can be exercised to restore in a person, can be worked on?
I think yes, because the brain is highly redundant. There are many other circuits you can make use of. So, but it needs some strategy. It probably doesn't feel like as natural as the real self. But if you get a weird sensations, maybe try to make sense of it based on your judgment. And when that happens, trying to establish a link of what the physical world should be like, and just practice that link to the special new feeling you get. Do you
Yeah,
understand what I mean?
yeah,
I
yeah.
think I say this based on some other studies that I think relatable, like how blind people, for example, see with a tactile information. So there are some like a vest designed to just locate things. If they have obstacles in the right hand or left hand side, then the vest have some bubbles inside, and they will push inside of their skin if there are obstacles. So over months of training, they can see, in a sense, making use of the tactile information. This is to remap how their sensory information that is intact with the physical cues. If this is the same thing with yourself, right? If you feel something weird happening, just using that weird sensation in certain phenomenon, in certain like physical location, and re-establish a link between what's actually going on and what you feel. I think that's something possible, but I don't have evidence. This is how I think.
No, that's a great explanation because the revisiting it and working on it. I could share that in the first year after my brain injury, I was like, my mind is not my mind, and I was once I realized that, I got into this mindfulness like meditation of just like a mantra, like my mind is not my mind, and I need my mind back. And it was almost like it wasn't sitting with the grief because I wasn't grieving it. I was just like so weirded out by it, but it wasn't working on being present. That took many more years. And then when the feeling went away, I can't really explain why that feeling went away, but it took about 6 years. So
Right.
I like the idea of the working on it, working towards it. And it's also kind of well, anxiety provoking, but it's a mind fuck when you're like, I'm not me. Myself is not me. I don't know what else. I think that's the appropriate word, so I'll use that word. But it's like it can be so daunting and overwhelming, and to be in that place where you're working on it, you need a lot of support. It's a cool idea. Let's get it out there, and people need support and a framework, and it would be nice to help them do that. Yeah.
I definitely agree with it. I think maybe if you want to have professional support, maybe search for neuropsychiatry. Mostly neurology are doing something physical part, and neuropsychiatry is doing something mental. So I think maybe your doctor is more like neurology, and he probably doesn't really understand your question. But I believe that these complaints can be addressed by other people with other specialties.
I think so, but also the recognition that that loss of self is not an identity issue, is not it doesn't fall into the normal categorization. Like a spinal cord injury would be injury to specific functions of
Yeah.
the nervous system. This is a different nervous system part. This is a different capacity and very fundamental. So yeah, I think that just having this research, having this discussion,
Yeah.
and or I shouldn't just having it out there and getting it out there would promote that. So thank you. Yeah, thank you for sharing
Yeah.
that.
Thanks.
You mind if
Yeah.
I say something?
Yeah.
I I've about a little over 4 years after my severe traumatic brain injury. And from what y'all are talking about with this iteration process, before my brain injury, I was studying artificial networks and building and deep learning them. And I guess then I understood like diffusion models and how you have noise presented to the model through the data. It can't recognize the data it's supposed to be recognizing. And you have to reiterate it baby steps over and over to build up the ability to generate, through a GAN model, a generative action versus even being able to recognize something in your object field. And it took me it took so much time to process the world and social environments to reduce the amount of noise to recognize normal stuff. And I like Hofstadter, so I'm just using that analogy to try to explain this because, like Dan's been saying, it's really hard to explain.
I think that's a great analogy. Actually, when
Yeah.
I think about it, I also use the deep learning kind of network structure.
Right?
I didn't actually realize that this was going on, and I've been figuring it out for the last 3 weeks and understanding that, like, I feel like I'm having an out of body experience and stuff. And like my brain says one thing, my vision and my physical stuff say something else, and so it's like really confusing to me as to what's true for my traumatic brain injury, my PTSD, my schizoaffective, my bipolar, my autism. I don't know how to navigate that situation and stuff, and it's really hard for me because it feels so real sometimes.
Yeah.
I wouldn't know how to navigate that either. The only thing that I can say is to share that, yeah, like once you realize it, it's like the nature of this thing is off. And then you start to characterize it or categorize it or make better sense of it. That's a thing I've heard a lot of brain injury people. I haven't spoken to other disorders, but with brain injury, once you gain awareness of that, some of the problems are constant. Some of them come and go. They change with stress. They change with fatigue. But yeah, these features that are discussed today is another layer. Otherwise, you don't even, or it's not like you don't even think about it. You just don't know how to make sense of it. I don't know if that helps.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you very much for coming today and making this presentation for us. I think I like to say we never know what we lost until we go to use it and we realize we don't have it anymore. But I don't think our identity fits into that category. It's been a long time after the first severe injury, wondering if my name was still Michelle. And then 4 years later with the second one, wondering again, is my name still Michelle? How can this happen again? So thank you for the explanations and the time that you spent with us today. It was very meaningful for me and I'm sure the rest of our community. So we really appreciate you coming. Thank you, Dan, for hosting this wonderful
Great.
event.
Thank you
for
very
the
much.
feedback.
I echo Michelle's appreciation and her considerations and everything you presented. It touched a lot of personal experience. Thank you.
Thank you for the feedback.
All right. There's much more to do, right? Research
Yeah,
and
there is.
questions and the dialogue with the brain injury people. So we're here. Yeah, cool.
I want to say a little bit like my my comments about like modern science or modern neuroscience. I feel like the field has always been focusing on things that are obviously like useful to us, like intelligence, for example, language, memory. Those things are overrated. Like what really determine the quality of life, it's really something more holistic. That's why they don't really characterize this as like very severe cases of function loss. They will think you can walk, you can talk, you can think, your memory is fine, and your intelligence score is very high. So what's your complaints? But what if you have this dissociative states? You are not you anymore. Like nothing. This is really meaningful. You don't make sense of things. Then I do echo you that it's a really great loss of dimensions of your life. And it's not even appreciated enough nowadays, because I feel there's a misplacement of what is considered important in our life. Not really intelligence, not how good speaker you are, how much score you can get from some memory task, but just to be at present, to be yourself. This
And
is really missing, I think.
to play a devil's advocate, those other things are important too. But to then say that what you're studying, what you're describing, and what you think is important, that whole self and inner self stuff is drastically important, especially when it's injured and changed, and they don't give people a benefit of the doubt in the sense that they're like, oh, get over it, or oh, it's just in your head, or they don't worry about it. But yeah, it is extremely important, and
Yeah. And
yeah.
even in psychological research or neuroscience research, there's no special module to study self. It's always like floating in some minor stream of research. Yeah. So
This is probably when you have to step into the philosophy realm and the
yeah,
philosophy
yeah,
and activists and people like Daniel Dennett and Thomas Nagel.
yeah. I think it's not science, it's philosophy, they would say.
Yeah. Maybe they'll come together one day.
Yeah.
Well, with this research, it at least indicates that it has to come together, and the feeling of when that is not feeling normal is really a devastating and debilitating thing. That yeah, it's more than just a, I don't know, mental state, or yeah, it's a part of a
Yeah.
person, it's a part of you, and when it's injured, it's horrible.
I know, yeah. But
Yeah.
The
it's
worst
coming.
part is the random part of it. Is
Random.
I test real good 98% of the time, but 2%, I'm frightening. I literally put my laundry in the oven. I mean, I am so proud. I run major corporations. But and same thing with the self. I never get to pick when I wake up and I'm not sure what my name is that day or where I belong, where I fit. And so you want to do any more study, we are just a fine bunch of lab rats waiting for you, doctor. There's so much they don't know, and we look so good, and we seem to be so good. And those of us that were really well educated and overskilled and, went through like parenting, and then this happened.
Wow.
It's,
Fascinating.
a lot to share from the inside that you can't see, that we're just dying to be heard.
Well said.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. Yeah, I just can't thank you enough. Really appreciate you.
Thank you for educating me of this. Yeah. I don't know. I wish our field could do more about it. I definitely would advocate about this research among my peers.
I think it's starting more and more. So anyway, on that, I think that's a good note to end on. And thank you again, Dr. Liu, and thank you everyone for coming. And all right, I think we're
All
done.
right.